Grayson gave a party for the crew and the cast, and Dan Curtis met me and said, "Do you want to write my show?" And I really was so tired of television people that I said, "Call me next week. I, I don't want to say yes, and I don't want to say no, and you don't know anything about me. And if you mean it, think it over and call me." So a week later he called and said, "Yes, I want you to write Dark Shadows." So I thought, I don't know anything about that kind of show. I don't know anything about vampires. I've never been interested in them. I don't know anything about, I've never been a movie fan of horror films. But I started to write it, and one didn't need to know anything because Dan knew it all. I don't know how or why. It's one of the great mysteries of life. But the moment he decided to turn the Dark Shadows into a vampire series, he knew all the horror that we eventually all learned. And the whole show was his. We added things, and we wrote it well, I think. We had to fire several writers because it was a difficult show to write. You had to write it seriously without writing down to it. You couldn't, we hired a well-known playwright to do it, and he made Barnabas into a kind of poetic fool when we knew that that Barnabas, the actor, had trouble learning lines. So you kept his speeches very simple as possible and filled with what we hoped was romantic serenity, so that he never was seemingly Byron-esque. He was Byron-esque. The dialogue was relatively straight. And we invented some interesting characters. And Dan aided and abetted. The meetings with him every week were always, I mean, he wouldn't take so many solutions we had and would send us out into the dark night saying, "Come up with something else by 10 o'clock tomorrow," you know. When the show was about 13 weeks short of being canceled, and Dan knew it, he said, "Well, let's have fun. Let's bring in a vampire and get rid of all the other plots." So that's what they did. And that's what saved the show, because it had simply been an aimless Gothic story before that, and the vampire pulled it all together. Grayson liked not having, she liked the unrequited thing about she and Barnabas, because she felt that it made her oddly sympathetic. That, again, the audience was saying, why doesn't he realize that she's madly in love with him, and why does he want to kill her when he decided he wanted to kill her, and will he succeed? There were many facets to play. Once you work with the same set of actors for 4 or 5 years, you really get to know them, and they get to know you. There's certain, Grayson, for example, I knew never to end an act on her because she had terrible reacting shots. And she would overact the moment you know, if someone just said, "I tried to kill her this minute," and she somehow missed the bullet, and if you shot to Grayson for Grayson's reaction, she would look like Lillian Gish in 1927. And so you learn these things that you tried to make the actors look better than they sometimes were. Though I do think that they did a great job in terms of the technical aspects of it. Then, I mean, now it would be shot completely differently. The important thing on the show were the characters, and I think that that's one reason the show is still being watched, that there were very definite, each of them had an individual character. And I remember Joan Bennett, who was supposedly the star of the show, because she'd been a big movie star 10 years before this. And she was a charming, charming woman. And she said to me once, we were going back in time. And so she was in an 18th century dress. And it was the first day of shooting, and I went in to her dressing room, and she was pushing up her breasts to get into the strapless costume. And I said, Joan, do you hate this going back? She said, oh, darling, she said, I just have spent so many early morning hours pushing up my breasts and getting into period costumes. And she said, I love it. I just love it. She said, I never thought that I would be offered this kind of situation again. And she made us really, because her character was quite ill-defined until Gordon and I took over. And because we liked her so much, we tried to make her a vital character. And also people like Nancy Barrett, we all liked, and so we turned what was fundamentally a giddy character into a real person, that we thought people would like. Angelique, we created completely. She was not on the show until we arrived. We created her, and she was fascinating to take a witch from Dominique and someone as beautiful and wily as Laura Parker is. It was great. It was a fun show, terribly demanding, terribly irritating, and terribly. The problems always seemed to be in the show that, I told this to Dan at the time, but he didn't accept it, that we had to keep getting more and more horrifying. And there was a very simple solution, which every soap opera in the world has done endlessly. The show was dependent upon the fact that my wife, Grayson, on the show, was the only person who knew that Barnabas was a vampire. And all he had to do was kill the Grayson character and let one other person discover Barnabas's secret, and it would have opened up so many other doors, and that we could have gone on playing the secret of Barnabas. But he thought that was simply cheating. And there was no way to keep the horror. We stole things right and left from all the horror classics, including The Werewolf, which worked for a while, and a lot of, I forgot the name, there was a great American short story writer who Lovecraft, that we stole a lot of. And I only wish that Stephen King had been alive then, or operating then, because he could have kept the show going for 100 years, you know.